Could the future of drag racing be going slower? I think it's a possibility. I think it opens up some interesting windows, and it gives us an interesting point of conversation this morning that I want to talk about with you folks today. As we have seen in the past, numerous different racing types have literally had to slow down to be able to continue to exist. It's existed in NHRA. It's existed in road racing with the old days of Le Mans, where they actually physically had to slow down vehicles. Formula One and Indy. Almost all of those cars no longer make the crazy amounts of power that they once made because it was just not safe. It was just not viable as a continued sport. And I think we're at an interesting inflection point, an interesting fork in the road, if you would, in the world of drag racing, where I think our future, at least as far as our future goes, is going to be slower racing. And let me tell you why I'm thinking that. Let me have a drink of Girly Man coffee first. So here's my thinking. Long ago, back in the 2000s or so, it was very, very difficult to build a street car or a street drivable car that made something north of 1,000 horsepower. It was insanely difficult. You had cars that were cammed out of their minds. They were massive compression. They ran on unbelievably expensive fuels. They had horrible street manners. They were not drivable on the streets. Enter into that conversation a huge change in the industry where you have variable valve timing. You have NOx sensors that are considerably more capable of being able to protect an engine. You have way better metallurgy that you had in the past in blocks. So you have stock factory blocks that can handle 1,000 plus horsepower. You have stock factory internals that can handle 800 to 1,000 or more horsepower. It becomes more of a standard thing. So where you used to be a king of the street if you showed up with a 500 horsepower street car, move that forward 20 years. If you show up with a 500 horsepower street car, you don't even get to be the flagger. You might get to hold the camera, but you're not anywhere near the actual real racing. And it's been interesting to see that development because it's come along very, very quickly. Over 20 years, we have moved unbelievably far. It is not hard at all to find an engine builder that will build you a 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 horsepower motor. It's not. Steve Morris can do it for you. You know, it's just make a phone call. Tom Nelson will do it for you. Any number of other machine shops in the country will do it for you. Heck, Bob McVeigh could probably do it for you if you can get him on the phone and make him build you something. But they're out there. There's tons of them. We all know somebody that's got a 1,000 plus horsepower, 1,500 horsepower motor. Billy, Street Racing Channel, has a number of them. Tommy, you know, those guys, they race cars that are 1,500 plus horsepower all day long, every day. That's what they do. And it's a very, very prominent piece of drag racing right now. But I think what's interesting is where we're seeing things like the Little Gangsters series that came about with Jimmy Dale and in the World Series of No Prep, where it's not necessarily about the person that makes the most power. It's the person that can run the most consistent times and compete in a race against someone else. And a lot of it is time off. You're not going to see it on the clock. You're not going to see what past speed was and what past time was. You're going to have a dial in that you're shooting for, and you're going to try to hit it. So it's like bracket racing, like index racing, but it's a little bit different. But the neat thing is, what it does is it levels the playing field. So it's not necessarily who spent the most money wins, which unfortunately is kind of a consistent theme in all of racing, whether that's drag racing or Formula One racing or whatever. Most of the time, the team that can spend the most money tends to win, or at least win more often. In that kind of racing, where it's, if you want to call it blue-collar racing or Little Gangsters racing or whatever it is, it's considerably more interesting. You limit the amount of tire that you can put on the back of a car, and you limit the speeds that you can run, and it really opens up a lot of options as far as being able to bring in the regular Joes, the you and me guys, that can build something in their garage and don't have a massive, 5-figure budget to be able to build a race car. And that actually brings me to another very interesting point, and what we saw with Cleetus McFarland on Sickweek this past year, or this year, where he had a budget race car, kind of, I guess I wouldn't call it a league, but kind of a little division between him and a couple of his friends, and Tom Bailey even got involved in that. And I think that's an interesting feature, or an interesting possible future for drag racing, is the budget racing scene. I think that's going to be something that over the next couple of years we could all see really explode, because it keeps things attainable. Where often we run into a problem with racing is you're never going to make money at racing. The old adage, how do you become a millionaire in racing, is you start off being a billionaire, because it's expensive. It's crazy expensive. Not just the building of stuff, but the going to the events, the fuel costs, the hotel costs, the travel costs, the truck, and all that stuff. Just the gate fee. You're going to spend tons of money to even get to the race, and let's say your car doesn't break anything and it goes back on the trailer in one piece, but you didn't win anything. It's still a very expensive weekend for most of us. So getting to some things that are more budget attainable, that are more interesting to people that are not extremely wealthy, that want to just be able to build something themselves in their own garage with their friends, it makes a ton of sense. Now, the problem with that's going to be, and I don't really have a great way to say this, it becomes an issue of honor. When you get to a situation where you have a budget build, you have to be able to trust the other racers that are in the same league as you, that they are going to abide by those exact same rules. So let's say it's a $10,000 limit. All in, $10,000, usually speaking, minus safety. So roll cage and brakes, usually those or maybe brakes and tires aren't included in it. It's similar to what I did with my 2500 road trip, which most of you have probably never seen. The idea is it's $2,500 and a 2,500 mile car, or $2,500 cars, 2,500 miles. So you can be all in, purchase price, modifications, repairs, whatever, $2,500, not including safety, so brakes, wheels, and tires. And it makes for a very interesting experience. But I've always done that with friends of mine, people that I know personally. And yeah, there's maybe a little bit of fudgery and inflation and such, where you can play with those numbers just a tiny little bit. But for the most part, you stick to that $2,500 budget, and you've got to be honest. You've got to be, honorable. As we can see in Cleetus' situation with James Tall, there may have been a little bit of fuzzy room there as far as I paid X amount of money for said chassis or said entire race car. And that's where things get a little bit tricky. So I think it could be a really interesting thing if we decided to go forward, and by we, I mean all of us in the racing community, decided to go forward with building a racing series around budget race cars. If it's maybe a subdivision of other things, or if it's something that's just a class that comes together, the question would be, how do you self-regulate that? Do you have some way of submitting your purchase, your purchase for your chassis, your purchase for your parts to some sort of a database so that all of us are on the up and up as far as what our pricing is, as far as how much money we have into it? Because it's very, very easy to say, oh yeah, I bought this chassis for $2,000. And it's a full race prep chassis with a Ford 9-inch, and it's got all the things that are in it, so it puts you miles ahead because you paid $2,000 for it. And that kind of gets rid of the whole purpose of doing this kind of a racing situation in the future. I think it's something that's very, very interesting. I know I don't do a ton of racing myself, but I've been around racing for a long, long time. I've been involved in racing with a lot of other people, not just drag racing, and road racing and street racing and endurance racing, and you name it. I've been around it for a long period of time, and I have seen a lot of development over this kind of thing. And I think the budget racing side of things is really, really interesting. I think the limited racing thing is really, really interesting. Again, back to the little Gangsters races. Massively popular race at a gigantic event that's mostly designed to be around really, really big, powerful cars. But the little Gangsters thing brought a whole bunch of people that would never be able to own a full race-built no-prep car. 2 chassis cars are not inexpensive, and it brought them out and it lets them do a racing thing. Same thing with Bill with the Plates and 28s thing, where you're bringing in It's not just the no prep scene where it's a bunch of guys that are in fully stripped out, real, balls to the walls race cars. When they put in those extra classes that bring back a lot of those guys that have older bracket cars, or they've got projects that they want to be able to go out and have a good time with, or they've got true actual street cars that run on real actual gas, and they want to be able to go out and have fun and enjoy their sport again, enjoy their hobby again. A lot of those guys have been left behind. Bill has mentioned it, and I mentioned it, Bob McVeigh mentioned it, a bunch of us mentioned it in different videos about how many different cars we saw at Plates and 28s at Edgewater Motorsports Park. How many different vehicles we saw that came out that we hadn't seen in forever. A lot of those guys had their vehicles sitting in garages for 10, 15, 20 years because their class had moved on. The sport had moved on past them. And the naturally aspirated big block Mopar just isn't competitive against the modern stuff. It's just not. It's more expensive, it's heavier, it's harder to make massive amounts of power. Versus, the modern stuff. And I get it. I've been there. My street racing car that's in the back in my garage, my twin turbo Dodge Stealth, that thing makes 400 wheel horsepower, all wheel drive. In 2003, 2004, that thing was a monster. It was a blast. It could do fantastically well against anything out there on the street. And it runs like high 12s. High 12s. You've got all kinds of commuter cars now that can run high 12s. But that was the creme de la creme. That was the best of the best back in those days. But the sport has moved on. The things have changed. So to be able to bring people back that used to do that kind of stuff, I think a lot of the limitations would be interesting to see. Now, whether that's ET restrictions, whether that's tire restrictions, because a big way you can restrict the amount of speed you can do is to restrict the amount of tire. If you don't have a good enough tire that you can't launch hard off the line, you're not going to be able to get there. It's not going to matter how much power you make. You make 2,000 horsepower, but you can only put 800 down to the ground. That opens up a lot of options. So however you want to do it, I think it's an interesting option. I think it's an interesting future for racing. And I personally am really excited about it because I don't have piles of money to spend on race car stuff, but I still want to go out and have fun and compete and do race car stuff with all my rowdy friends. And I think there's probably a lot of people that agree with me on this. And it's going to be an interesting moment to see where things change, how things adapt now that we're seeing some of this really starting to become more and more popular. And it makes me pretty positive, honestly, about the racing community in general. I think there's a lot of good future ahead of us. I think maybe this door opening has kind of given another, I don't know if this is probably the fifth wind, but it's reinvigorated the sport because people are seeing, oh, hey, this is something we can do. And I would love to see somebody be able to take this and run with it. Whether or not it's Jimmy Dale with the little Gangsters thing, or if it's IHRA with, I think they called it their blue collar racing division. Who knows what happens with that whole situation, or if it's just something that local tracks decide to do with a series. I brought up in a recent video when I was talking about the IHRA specifically about doing a racing series of the tracks that they're now affiliated with National Trails, Killcare, Milan, and Dragway 42. You're kind of in a little bit of a loop there. You could make a racing series if you wanted to do a budget car, a budget racing series. It could be a really cool series to see who can go the fastest for the cheapest, and it keeps the big dollar guys, the big money builds out of that blue collar racing. Because I'll be honest, getting outrun by somebody who can just throw money at the problem is really frustrating. We always want to see the David versus Goliath battle, and we rarely ever cheer for Goliath. It's almost always David. And usually most of us are probably going to be David. So it's cool to be able to see somebody that goes out there and fights and wins against the big dogs. But it'd be more interesting to see if it's a whole bunch of Davids. It's a whole bunch of guys with budget builds that are going out there and competing. And I'm sure there's other tracks that have done something similar to this. I'm sure there's other people in series that have looked into this whole budget race car thing. I just think right now is a very interesting time, especially with what Cleetus did and what he did with his group on Sickweek, and then what we see going on right now in the no prep scene and the time off type stuff. I think it's an interesting feature. I think it's something we should keep an eye on, and I'm excited to see what happens in the drag racing world. I'm excited to be hopefully part of that. I would personally be interested in building like maybe my 68 Le Mans into something like that, where I could go out and I can compete at a decent level and still have a lot of fun, but not have to spend, a house to be able to go fast. So, I don't know. What do you guys think? Are you excited about the future of drag racing? Do you think that this kind of racing has something to give us? Do you think there's some kind of a future ahead of this? How would you do a budget racing league? How would you keep track and make people be honorable? Because let's be honest, there's a lot of cheating in drag racing. In racing in general. Anytime there's competition, humans are going to find an edge. They're going to find a cheat. So how do you make it legitimate? How do you make sure people aren't fudging the numbers to make it fair for all and still interesting and competitive? That's a challenging thing. There's also a conversation about, bringing back list racing. I think that's a huge thing that you could see with different regions. And to harken back, I'll talk about this on another thing, but the original Street Outlaws show, when it first came out, changed absolutely everything. Like, you took an entire industry that was kind of ho-hum, and you put it on its ear. You changed absolutely everything. Now, obviously, over the years, that entire thing has changed quite a lot. But it would be really neat to see that kind of thing become a basic tenet of racing, where you have teams that are from different tracks or from different regions, and they compete against other teams in maybe something like a budget car racing series. Could be some interesting racing, could bring out some interesting people, and it will reinvigorate and involve people that, like me, can't afford to just throw piles and piles of money at a problem to go fast. So, anyways, guys, I'm going to finish off my coffee. I got to go buy some more parts for stuff. I just want to talk to you guys about this. Hope you had a great weekend. Look forward to seeing you in the comments. As always, I will pay attention to the comments, and I do try to respond back to everybody out there. All of you guys that watch this stuff help pay my bills. You help make me be successful, so I truly do appreciate you. If this is your very first video here, I am Austin. These are Automotive Adventures with Austin. This is more of my just coffee morning mutterings or musings, whatever it is. But most of this channel is about me, my cars, my projects, and my adventures. So if you're interested in this kind of thing and you can put up with me, click on the subscribe button. If you made it this far, I truly do appreciate you. Click on the like button. If you've been here for videos before in the past, you're awesome. Thank you guys so much. You're helping to make this whole thing possible, and I'm looking forward to what we've got going on in the future. So hope you have a great rest of your day. We'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye.